Welcome to the Quirks German X, the series where I take a look at the unique German parts of games to see how they differ to the originals. This can be censorship, voice acting, and other quirky changes. Currently, we're taking a look at the entire Wolfenstein series, going all the way from Wolfenstein 3D in the first video to the New Order in the last episode. Since I don't want to repeat myself, I highly recommend taking a look at that one because I'll be referencing it a lot throughout this video. Again, I don't want to repeat myself, because this episode is all about the Old Blood, the prequel to the New Order, and the reimagining of Return to Castle Wolfenstein. So, in a way, it's a return to Castle Wolfenstein. There's really not much more to say, except if you enjoy this video, you can show me that with a like, a comment, or even by supporting me directly on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you get to see these videos 1 week earlier than everybody else. But enough of that, let's cut open these wounds and take a look at the old blood spilling out with the censorship. Regarding the old blood and gore, it went completely unchanged, as was the case in the New Order. There are fewer horrifyingly disfigured corpses this time around, but that's not due to the censorship. Speaking of censorship, the Wolfenstein logo unsurprisingly returns here as well. What I didn't mention in the previous video is that it actually doesn't always fit other flags properly, a problem that's shared across both games. It's not quite as bad as it was in 2009, but it's not perfect either. It's just a bit misaligned. The newly introduced wolf's head appears on the uniforms again too, replacing the SS runes and swastikas. I think it fits brilliantly onto the propaganda posters you can see hanging around. This is something that looks straight out of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, very tongue-in-cheek. Despite the Nazis still being called the regime, both these symbols make way more sense here, since all these soldiers are stationed around Castle Wolfenstein, and therefore could have received special symbols to acknowledge that. Maybe this is the Wolfenstein division of the regime, just for this one weird region in Germany. I mean, Totenkopf has his own little army, so I don't see why someone researching ancient artifacts to win the war couldn't also. It also makes more sense for the Wolfenstein logo to appear within the castle itself, like I mentioned in my Return to Castle Wolfenstein video. While King Otto, who built the castle, has a different symbol entirely, it still works better than having swastikas etched into bricks and such. Perhaps this is the official emblem of the castle itself. Otherwise, it would imply that they defaced centuries-old relics when moving in, just to add their own stupid little symbols everywhere. Well, to be fair, that wouldn't surprise me. Oh, and the ranks and the uniforms are also still just random shapes. I've already talked about the secret night levels in the first video, so I won't go into detail there. But one of my viewers pointed out that the uniforms of the soldiers there might be green because only the SR, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi party, wore brown. The Wehrmacht, the German army during World War II on the other hand, wore green instead. So these wouldn't necessarily be Nazis, just German soldiers. Also, it said Napoleon wore red because if he got wounded in battle, his soldiers wouldn't see the blood and get discouraged. That's the same reason why Hitler wore brown pants. Anyway, it is a bit weird when all the hanging skeletons you can find in the levels also wear green, which makes it look more like these Germans are killing their own soldiers. Oh, and speaking of the uniforms, they actually updated the posters above the beds this time and turned them green there too. But it's not actually the same shade of green, which makes me unreasonably upset. Furthermore, the paintings of that random general are exactly that, just some random dude. You can find a non-pixelated version of it at several points throughout the game, even in the New Order. On the topic of paintings, the one I jokingly said depicts Cancer Mouse could actually be a reference to the weird rats from Wolfenstein for the SNES. If that's true, then that's really cute. But Cancer Mouse might have been referenced elsewhere, namely in the arcade game in the New Colossus. One of the high score names is called Panzer Mouse. But if it's a reference, then they must have added it after the fact because Civi hasn't been around for that long. Anyway, let's try to get back on topic and talk about the name changes. For starters, the Nazis are also just called the regime here.
Could be our last chance, this. Before the Nazis wipe out all that's good in the world.
Das ist womöglich die letzte Chance, bevor das Regime alles Gute in der Welt vernichtet.
I still think it's a boring change, especially because characters don't really seem to show much contempt towards them. They barely insult them compared to the original, and even if they do, they're rather childish remarks.
Remember your cover. Commander Franz, Nazi bastard from the SS in Frankfurt.
Ihr Deckname? Kommandant Franz, Spezialeinheit des Regimes aus Frankfurt.
You sick little Nazi fuck.
Aha, little Nazi fuck. You are a funny man.
Du krankes Dreckschwein.
Dreckschwein.
I mean, I don't like cursing, and even I think it's too little. How difficult is it to just call them a-holes or something? Well, they do it sometimes, even when the English version didn't, it's just not consistently enough.
Look at that. It's raining Nazis.
Sieh einer an. Es regnet Arschlöcher.
Why do they hate us so much?
Because their brains got broke, I reckon.
Warum hassen sie uns so sehr?
Ihr Hirn im Arsch ist, schätze ich.
In fact, everyone seems to say fewer swears in general.
Jesus Christ. That's a big fucking dog.
Meine Güte. Was für ein verdammter Riesenhund.
Or do they?
Wie viele von diesen Arschlöchern gibt es auf dieser Welt?
It's inconsistent all around, even in the original, which sometimes claims characters are using certain curses when they just aren't.
Ach, Schreiner, verdammt nochmal, jetzt lassen Sie mich doch erstmal meinen Wein genießen.
So maybe there's no pattern to it and these are just hiccups. Anywho, all Nazi references have been wiped away entirely again. The Führer is still the Staatsoberhaupt.
Im Hauptquartier des Führers sprach der Oberkommandierende des Heeres. Im Hauptquartier des Staatsoberhauptes sprach der Oberbefehlshaber über die jüngsten Erfolge der Armee.
The SS Paranormal Division just gets turned into a special unit for the paranormal.
Handpicked by Death's Head himself as a key member of the SS Paranormal Division.
Ausgewählt von Totenkopf selbst. Hohes Tier der Spezialeinheit für paranormale Vorgänge.
And ranks like the Obersturmbannführer get turned into ones that are still being used today.
Frau Obersturmbannführer von Schaps ist hier.
Hören Sie gut zu, Schreiner.
Frau Oberstleutnant von Schaps ist hier.
So they really are just the regime here with no connection to those awful bastards. However, they still manage to sneak in their salute. Alright, I'm kidding. The question, however, is what to call the Nazis here. Unlike the New Order, nothing in this game is directly based on anything the Nazis ever did in real life. They never raised the dead and never imprisoned anyone in the Nazi castles either. To be honest, I have no idea what tone the game is going for in general. It tries to be serious at some times, like how BJ comments on all the death and suffering. But then all the skeletons you find are adorned with cute little helmets and weapons, and it's implied the soldiers are taking naps within the crypts they're raiding. Like, none of the previous games, and not even Indiana Jones ever went there. And it even stands out against the New Order with concepts like the actual Nazi zombies, like full-on Call of Duty Nazi zombies. To remind you, the previous game threw you into a concentration camp. And here, you're fighting a massive undead beast that has been entombed under a giant Nazi castle for centuries. It still feels weird to call them pea babies, though. Not because it'd be disrespectful towards any victims of the Nazis, but because they're the same people that appear in the New Order and cause all the horrible crimes there. As over the top as this game may be, it's still connected to that one. So I'm just sticking with not even mentioning them at all for now. But one of those days, we really ought to have a discussion about the inconsistent tone of these games. You can be either respectful and serious, or shoot zombies as you're riding your giant mech through a burning German town. Not both. Anyway, the Nazis weren't the only ones to get removed from this version, as all Jewish references are gone once again.
Welcher Tag ist heute?
17th of March. It's a Sunday.
The day of Purim. I made this gift for my friend and father's workshop here in Wolfsburg. It's Jewish tradition to give food on this day. Welcher Tag ist heute?
Der 17. März. Sonntag.
Heute ist Feiertag. Dies ist ein Geschenk für meine Freundin. Ich habe es bei meinem Vater gemacht. Es ist doch Brauch, sich was zu schenken.
That confused me so much when I played the game for the first time. Why would she just mention it's a holiday? What holiday? How's it relevant? I didn't even make the connection that Annette could even be Jewish, because she's said to have only been rescued from a prisoner transport, instead of having been rescued from being deported.
Rescued from a deportation convoy heading over. Ich habe sie aus einem Gefangenentransport nach Wolfsburg gerettet.
I mean, just why? Why was this necessary? I can see scrubbing away Nazi references, but Jewish ones? Alright, fine, the game is even more outlandish than the New Order, but this is actually massively disrespectful. Not wanting to mention the Holocaust in the game with zombies in the occult, I can sorta see that. But literally taking away such a large part of someone's identity? What for? What does it serve? Guess what? Queer people were deported too, so would they have also turned us straight if they could? Man, that really makes me mad. What unnecessary, insulting, intrusive censorship. Erasing Nazis? That's fine. Nothing of value is lost there. But erasing Jewish people? Yeah, that's what the Nazis were trying to do, you idiots! Well, here's hoping that at least the voice acting isn't as completely awful as that part. When it comes to the voice acting, the Oblad actually stands out a lot. Much like in the New Order, a lot of voices are shared between the original and the German version. However, this time almost the entire cast is the same actors. This makes my job a lot easier because I won't have to compare them as much, especially when it comes to the audio that already was German. I'll only go into depth with them if it's relevant or particularly interesting. Again, I'll be using the code forum as a reference for the actor names. Let's start with BJ once more, who is still played by Johannes Behrens and who still sounds exactly the same as before. An exhausted, broken, pained and almost lifeless individual.
Oh Mann, Blazkowicz, du bist ganz schön fertig. Der Krieg ist ja eine Krankheit. So viele Kameraden gehen an ihr zugrunde. Ich spüre den Wind des nahenden Sturms. Wesley, habe ich Ihnen von Tante Sarah erzählt? Als sie im College war, wurde bei ihr Demenz festgestellt. Die Medikamente machten sie benommen und merkwürdig. Ich erinnere mich noch an ihre Augen, wie dreckige Fenster an einer verlassenen Hütte. Dieser Geruch, wie in dem Sumpf daheim bei Johnsons Hof. Tote Pflanzen und modriges Holz. Als ich klein war, sagte mein Vater, wir hätten ein Monster im Keller. Und wenn ich nicht brav wäre, würde es mich eines Nachts holen. Also war ich immer schön artig. Aber das Monster kam trotzdem.
And whose favorite pastime is lamenting those we've lost.
Ich hab versucht, ihn zu retten, Pippa. Das hast du nicht verdient, Pippa.
Despite all this, he's still willing to bear the weight of the world, even if it's clearly tearing him up inside.
Ist das Gewicht der Welt auf Ihren Schultern zu schwer, Agent Blazkowicz?
Ich hab ziemlich breite Schultern, Agent One. Was soll dieser Wahnsinn? Du bist wie ein blinder Wurm, der sich immer tiefer in die Erde frisst. Tiefer und tiefer in ihre verrotteten Eingeweide. In die dunklen Orte, die besser vergessen bleiben sollten. Das Monster stirbt nie, wie oft man es auch tötet. Es wechselt nur seine Haut, verändert seine Gestalt. Ich fühle, wie das Gewicht der Welt auf mir lastet. Aber ich stemme mich dagegen. Ein letztes Mal. Dann ist Schluss.
Like his heroic attitude and spite are all that's keeping him alive. Well, that and his immense hatred for Nazis.
Wenn ich entkomme, grill ich dich auf diesem Stuhl, bis du stirbst. Und wenn ich mit dir fertig bin, dann töte ich deinen Köter. Ich hab deinen Scheißhund erledigt, Rudi.
However, BJ seems more human this time around. He doesn't just mumble about battle plans or his next objective anymore, but sometimes just about random stuff he notices.
Diese Box steckt voller Überraschungen.
Even his quips seem to be less cruel and more witty and lighthearted than in the New Order.
Alles klar. Die Kerle sind tot. Sie können... Amerikaner! Ist schon gut.
Hier wimmelt von Soldaten des Regimes. Seien Sie vorsichtig. Töten Sie nur, wenn es nicht anders geht.
Wie bitte? Ich soll jeden töten, den ich sehe?
Nein, ich sagte...
Kann Sie nicht verstehen, Kessler. Zu viel Störgeräusche.
Which is fair, as he hadn't been broken as much at this point. This is technically the same BJ whose idea of a vacation is killing even more enemies. So it's only good that the German dub captures this aspect of him just as well. The inconsistency between him being an American but still speaking fluent German has been addressed in this port, somewhat. While in the original, he repeats his disguise's name to himself and practices a few phrases, he just remarks how ridiculous he finds the whole plan here.
Commandant Franz aus Frankfurt. Guten Morgen. Guten Morgen. Fuck it.
Kommandant Franz aus Frankfurt. Ob das funktionieren wird? Ach, scheiß drauf.
still doesn't make perfect sense. Wesley points out that BJ's disguise is terrible instead of his spoken German.
Okay, look. You're German? Frankly, it's atrocious. So no talking. And keep your gun holstered for as long as you can.
Also gut. Ihre Tarnung ist ehrlich gesagt grauenvoll. Nicht sprechen. Und lassen Sie Ihre Waffe möglichst lange stecken.
However, BJ intentionally looks like the quote perfect Aryan, which fools basically every idiot he comes across. Surely this blonde, blue-eyed fridge of a person can't be a non-German. So the problem in the games is more that he gets caught once he opens his mouth, unlike here. On the topic of that, the whole hot dog joke doesn't work either, unless he somehow got really nervous at the sight of Jäger and forgot his lines. But for a man like BJ, that makes no sense.
Augenblick, warten Sie. Aus Frankfurt. Sind Sie Frankfurter?
Ja, ein Hotdog.
So ein komischer Kauz. Die spinnen, die Amis. Hotdog. Aus Frankfurt. Sind Sie Frankfurter?
Ja, ein Hotdog.
And yet, it gets even worse later. When talking to Helga, he introduces himself as Franz in the original due to his heavy accent, which Helga then catches on to. In the dub, however, he says it correctly, which meant they had to redo her line as well.
Wie heißen Sie?
Franz.
Franz. Wie heißen Sie?
Franz.
Franz.
So it's less obvious she's onto him, which could raise the tension. However, a little more than a minute later, even German Helga addresses him as Franz.
Haben Sie Ihr Schicksal in der Hand? Franz?
Lady, where'd you even get that from? Nobody said it. And even weirder, she then just calls him Franz later on still.
Franz, mein Ober.
It also falls apart because BJ simply doesn't have the quote interesting accent that Helga speaks of.
Und?
Köstlich.
Sie haben einen interessanten Akzent.
Alright, it is very difficult to translate BJ's inability to speak German and getting caught as a result into, well, German. However, they could have still managed to get it across. How about, instead of saying everything correctly, BJ spoke with a heavy stutter? That would imply he's not perfectly fluent in the language, or at the very least, is trying to stick to an exact plan, but failing. And instead of pointing out his accent, characters would simply notice that he's not completely confident in what he's saying, ergo, he's hiding something. Bam! Problem solved right there. Hire me, Bethesda. Oh, and one thing is kind of lost in translation regarding all of this. In the original, Helga suddenly starts speaking English once she figures out BJ is an American spy.
Warum verschwenden Sie Ihre Zeit mit diesem Banausen?
Because, my dear, incompetent Shriner, he's not a waiter. He's a spy!
Since she just speaks German here, that oh no moment when you realize that she knows doesn't really exist here. His partner Richard Wesley, aka Agent 1, is next, played here by Tobias Schmidt. Schmidt has done a lot of voice work, most of which were for things I don't even know. He did, however, voice James in Thomas and Friends and a character in Naruto. As Wesley, he's perfectly fine, sounding pretty much the same as the original.
That was Rudy Jaeger, Helga's second in command. I hear he feeds his dogs with prisoners from the castle's dungeon.
Das war Rudy Jäger, Helgas Stellvertreter. Er soll seinen Hunden Gefangene aus dem Burggefängnis zum Fraß vorwerfen.
Being British, he's just a very dry character, not really showing much personality.
Hatte mal das Pech, hier bei einem Einsatz in Tansania über den Weg zu laufen. Hab ich das schon erzählt, Blaskowitsch? Hatte Schwarzwasserfieber damals. War der schlimmste Tag meines Lebens. Nicht mal eine ausgiebige Whisky-Kur hat geholfen. Glauben Sie das? Na, was soll's.
Though, he can be funny sometimes.
Also, wenn ich ein Tresor wäre, wo würde ich mich verstecken? Würde ich gar nicht, weil ich nicht denken könnte. Ich würde einfach nur sein. Aber wo
and he can also show other emotions like being stressed, exhausting himself, yelling, and being in pain.
Tja, das ist nicht viel wert, wenn wir hier nicht rauskommen. Hier, ich habe einen Weg nach draußen gefunden. Kommen Sie, ich helfe Ihnen hoch.
Geschafft! Kommen Sie schnell! Hier hoch!
Kommen Sie, Wesley.
Blazkowicz.
Ja.
Da haben wir uns aber was Schönes eingebrockt, was?
Keine Ahnung, wie Sie überlebt haben. Kommen Sie.
Look, he appears for what feels like 5 minutes. What do you really want me to say? All in all, he plays his role well. The only thing worth pointing out is that his British accent and speaking quirks are all gone.
Well, we're losing the bloody war.
Nobody told me.
HQ's put a tight lid on it.
Nun, wir verlieren ihn, diesen Scheißkrieg.
Hat mir keiner gesagt.
Das Hauptquartier hält's unter Verschluss.
And that they forgot to dub one of the original lines where he speaks German.
Guten Morgen.
Morgan.
Guten Morgen.
Morgan.
On the topic of that, for someone who chastises BJ for not being able to speak it well, your German isn't flawless either, Wesley Might.
Vielen Dank. Wiedersehen.
Next is Ludwig Kessler, our first in a long line of characters that weren't recast. He's voiced by Urs Remond, or Remond, a Swiss actor, voice actor, and even director. Not familiar with his work though, I'm afraid. You know, I'm just going to mention if I'm familiar with the work from now on. Anyway, there's really nothing I could say about him in the German dub other than more or less gesturing in the direction of the original because they are one and the same. He's just a very serious and down-to-earth person, often sounding like a sad, lonely old man, whose only motivation for getting out of bed is fighting the Nazis.
Diese Stadt ist voller Geheimnisse. Durch ihre Geschichte ziehen sich Tod und Zerstörung. Und jetzt wühlt Helga in ihren verrotteten Eingeweiden mit der morbiden Neugier eines Kindes.
Was ist in der Tasche?
Flugblätter. Meine Frau hat früher welche verteilt in der Hauptstadt. Das Regime hat sie dafür aufgeknüpft.
Erledigen Sie die Schweine, Agent Blazkowicz! Töten Sie alle!
I do think a speech before heading out for Wolfsburg is better here.
So, where are we going, Kessler?
To Wolfsburg. That's where Helga will be, with the document folder.
What's in Wolfsburg?
Death, Agent Blazkowicz. Death.
Und? Wo fahren wir hin, Kessler?
Nach Wolfsburg. Dort werden wir Helga finden. Und auch die Akte.
Was ist in Wolfsburg?
Der Tod, Agent Blazkowicz. Der Tod.
Though, it could be even better.
Was ist in Wolfsburg?
Der Tod, Agent Blazkowicz. Der Tod.
There's really not much more to talk about, he just does a good job. Well, I guess I could mention that he looks kind of like a younger version of my dad. Oh, now it's getting very exciting for me. Because here's Annette Krause, my favorite character in the entire game. Maybe even in the entire series. Played by Lily Fichtner, German actress and singer, she delivers such an endearing and kind-hearted character, whose sweetness exceeds even German Anja from the New Order.
Wie heißt du?
Annette. Und Sie? Billy Boy. Billy Boy. Billy Boy. Seltsamer Name für einen erwachsenen Mann.
Manche nennen mich einfach BJ.
Schon besser. Sie sehen aus wie ein BJ.
Danke fürs Kompliment.
Meine Sachen.
Hier.
Oh, danke.
It just feels good to listen to her, with a voice that's so soft and warm, like auditory gold. Even if the world is going to hell outside, as long as you're listening to her, you know everything will be alright. And that makes sense, considering net translates to nice. But it's not like she's a helpless pacifist or anything, as she believably puts up a good fight. She also has this habit of breathing through her mouth between words, which is a little more pronounced in the German dub. I kind of like that, it adds a bit of character. What I simply adore, however, is her relationship to her girlfriend Katrin. Only implied at first, you quickly catch on to how strong the love that she has for her is. how determined she is to try to find her, even if it may cost her a life. Because without love, what else is there to live for?
Dies ist ein Geschenk für meine Freundin. Ich habe es bei meinem Vater gemacht. Es ist doch Brauch, sich was zu schenken. Es sollte etwas Besonderes sein.
Was ist das?
Eine Katze. Ihr Lieblingstier. Ich wollte sie ihr geben, aber dann kam sie und... Es ist schon so lange her.
Herr Kessler, ich muss Sie finden.
Woher weißt du, dass sie noch hier ist?
Es ist nur so ein Gefühl.
Bedeutet sie dir viel?
Ich muss an Sie denken. Die ganze Zeit.
Dann werde ich für sie beten, dass sie dich wiederfindet.
Ich war schon mal hier. In der Woche nach Weihnachten. Mit meiner Freundin. Wir sind hier reingeschlichen, um den Badehausgeist zu sehen. Die Heizung war aus wegen der Bomben. Im Becken war Eis. Wir tanzten zum Grammophon in Herr Obermanns Büro. Und ich weiß noch, wie wir lachten und froren und wie wir Angst hatten, dass sie uns erwischen und mich mitnehmen. Ich gab ihr ein Versprechen. Was auch mit mir geschehen mochte, ich würde zu ihr zurückkommen.
Du kannst nicht ganz allein gehen. Nicht mit diesen Monstern.
Wenn ich nicht gehe, dann kann ich die Monster auch gleich meine Eingeweide rausreißen lassen. Ich steige dort oben durch das Loch und Sie helfen mir. Das werden Sie doch, Herr BJ.
A quick side topic, Katrin has no lines in the game, but apparently she has the same voice actress as Pippa. It's possible that originally they had planned for Annette and her to be together, but ultimately changed their mind. Perhaps because Pippa ends up dying, and they felt it would be nice if Annette got together with her girlfriend in the end after all. Which she does, and which made me very happy. Yes!
Komm, junge Dame, wir müssen dich hier wegbringen.
Wir haben's geschafft. So, if that's the case, then I really welcome that change. There's enough suffering in this world, we don't need to add more onto it. Since we're on the topic of Pippa, she's still played by the British-German actress, voice actress, and singer Marianne Graffam. In the original, she puts on a British accent, but her German one still bleeds through now and then.
Bloody hell. Where's your shirt, you handsome sod? I'm sorry. This is not the time for maudlin stories. Listen, I know what you're after, Blasco. But for God's sake, put some bloody clothes on first.
She obviously drops the British one for this dub, since we don't want to repeat Condition Zero.
Meine Güte, wo ist dein Hemd, mein Hübscher? Hör zu, ich weiß, was du suchst, Blasco. Der Kerl in meinem Bett da hinten ist einer von Helgas Leuten. Bevor er einschlief, habe ich ihn zum Reden gebracht. Die Akte, die du suchst, ist in Helgas Zimmer im Gasthaus von Wolfburg. Sie scheint eine Schwäche für Wein zu haben. Verkleide dich als Ober, dann kommst du vielleicht an sie ran. Aber um Himmels Willen, zieh dir vorher was an.
There's just not much more to say, because she is among the fewest lines in the entire game. I mean, there are side characters with bigger speaking roles. Still, she isn't bad at all either, being comparable to Kessler. And here's the last two good guys who actually were redubbed. First up is the town drunkard, played by Alan Orpin in the original and Wolfrass in the German dub. Wolfrass, like wolf's meal.
Mein Freund, mein großzügiger regimehassender, halbnackter Irrer. Er ist kein schlechtes Omen. Vielleicht träumt er diese verfluchte Stadt endlich auf. Aber solange ich dich habe, wird mir nichts passieren.
I can see why they recast him, since the original had a bit of a thick accent.
Du schon wieder! Verdammter Nazi-liebender Dreckskerl! Du sollst verrotten wie der Rest dieser gottverlassenen Stadt!
Though, I kind of think it works, since it's like he's drunkenly slurring his speech. Either way, he sounds just like a guy who said one too many that morning, so both work well. And the last one is Fergus, still played by Roland Hemmo. Absolutely nothing new to add here. He's a little bit cheeky.
Heilige Scheiße. Scheiß Tote einfach überall.
Da ist er ja.
Fergus.
Kommen Sie, helfen Sie mir, Sie fauler Hund.
A little bit crude.
Ach, verflucht. Hab vergessen, aufs Klo zu gehen. Warum haben Sie mich nicht dran erinnert?
Sehe ich aus wie Ihr Babysitter, Fergus?
Ach, scheiß drauf.
And a little bit serious.
Wie haben Sie mich gefunden?
Habe einen Notruf von Pippa bekommen. Haben Ihre Leiche gefunden.
Wesley haben Sie auch, Fergus.
Scheiße, Verfluchter.
And I still like him just as much as I did in the New Order. And now the bad guy, starting with Rudi Jäger, played by actor Ben Young in both versions. Hold on just a second. Aus Hamburg. Sind Sie Hamburger? Ja, ein Big Mac. Die spinnen, diese Schauspieler. Anyway, the overwhelming majority of his lines are the same in both versions of the game, so I'm just going to talk about him as a character. And my goodness, what a character. He's just such a massive bastard. Really nailing that I do bad things but I don't care, I still think I'm good personality.
An dem ist viel gutes Licht. Lasst euch schmecken. Ich komme in einer Stunde wieder. Dann gehen wir Gassi. Du redest nicht viel, oder? Keine Sorge. Wir haben reichlich Zeit, uns so richtig aneinander zu gewöhnen.
At times, he sounds a bit exaggerated, really showing his theater experience.
Aber natürlich, du armes Ding, ein bisschen Fett ansetzen, ja. Wir wollen doch nicht, dass du hier drin dahin fliegst, nicht wahr? Es gibt genug für alle, keine Sorge.
But I kinda feel like that's the point, like he doesn't even think that he's worth talking to these quote lesser people in a normal manner. He does come across like an actual person mostly, maybe one that isn't quite right in the head.
Warum bist du so stur? Deine Leute sterben da draußen, auf den Stränden, den Feldern, das ist jämmerlich! Wie Insekten ohne Flügel! Ihr habt den Krieg verloren!
Greta war hungrig. Ich wollte das Fleisch nicht verkommen lassen, das verstehst du doch.
He's even believable when screaming out in pain. What I find worth mentioning is that he's the first Nazi so far to address BJ using the informal version of you, du, rather than the polite Sie.
Wenn ich diesen Knopf drücke, wird über dieses Wasser Strom durch deinen Körper geleitet und du wirst die entsetzlichsten Schmerzen erleiden, die du je erlebt hast.
This was not the case in the New Order, which is strange because the same people that consider BJ to be less than vermin will still be nice enough to address him formally. So I'm glad they fixed this issue here. Overall though, an amazing character. Very over the top, borderline cartoony at times, but that's what makes him great. I did like how insane he becomes from grief, crying out for his murdered dog while shooting at BJ.
Du hast meinen Hund getötet! Meine Greta! Sie war mein Ein und Alles! So liebevoll! So verzeiht! Ich hab sie geliebt! Sie war der glücklichste Hund der Welt!
From one bastard to the next, here's Helga von Schaps, portrayed by German actress Gabriele Scharnitzky in both versions. And I just have to say, wow. She has an absolutely wonderful voice, and I am genuinely in love with her performance here. She doesn't just nail it, she perfects the character. Her Helga has a lot of speaking quirks that are common with women her age, to the point where she even reminded me of an ex-coworker of mine.
Oh, Ihre Fürsorge ist wirklich reizend, Karl. Wir brauchen Treibstoff für den Laderoboter, weil das Ding im Nu alles geschluckt hat, was wir ihm gefüttert haben. Und ich brauche eine Kiste Wein. Der Wein, den die hier auftischen, ist grauenvoll. Also, mehr Treibstoff für den Laderoboter und für mich. Ja, Karl? Expedition Wolfsburg, Ende.
But her entire performance, it's so multifaceted. When listening to her backstory, she seems almost sympathetic, as if you want to root for her. Like, you go girl, go chase your dreams!
Als Kind habe ich meine eigenen Karten gezeichnet und im Wald bei uns zu Hause nach Schätzen gegraben. Ja, so konnte ich allein sein. Und dann bekam ich auf einmal Polio. Ich war Monate ans Bett gefesselt, hatte schreckliche Träume. Und dann starb mein Bein ab. Habe ich deswegen geheult? Aber natürlich. Ist ja normal. Aber aufgeben ist was für Schwächlinge. Ich habe nie aufgegeben. Ich habe mein Schicksal in die Hand genommen.
She doesn't even appear like an evil person at first, being very polite and kind, even towards BJ disguised as a waiter.
Mein lieber Ober, Sie wirken so angespannt. Stellen Sie den Wein hier auf den Tisch.
However, it's when you consider what her dreams are and what she's willing to do to achieve them that you realize that it's more of a facade. Because while she's initially also friendly towards her patients, it becomes clear that she's only doing so to coax important information out of them, sounding overly saccharine but with a subtle yet bitter aftertaste.
Wurst vom Delikatessenladen Hirsch. Ach, Sie können mir Ihre Träume erzählen, Herr Trommler. Bei mir sind Sie sicher. Nehmen Sie noch etwas Wein.
Ich will eigentlich mit meinen Freunden dorthin. Wir haben immer gespielt, dass wir ein Abenteuer erleben.
Herr Trommler, das kann ich mir vorstellen. Als kleines Mädchen habe ich nämlich im Wald vor unserem Haus Ritter gespielt. Ja. Bitte beschreiben Sie mir Ihren Traum weiter.
And when those sane patients burst into tears while talking about their traumatic experiences, she's being extremely inconsiderate towards them because she only cares about that information.
Name erinnert mich nicht.
Denken Sie nach, Herr Trommler. Nehmen Sie noch einen Schluck Wein. Und denken Sie nach.
Was passiert jetzt mit mir? Kann ich wieder zurück?
Ich denke, dass Sie dafür zu krank sind. Aber das muss natürlich Ihr Arzt beurteilen. Ich werde alles tun, um Ihre Lage zu verbessern. Bringen Sie ihn zurück auf die Station. Die Befragung ist beendet.
When she catches on to BJ being a spy, that facade begins to peel away and you see her for who she truly is. When she not so nicely demands that you drink all of the sour wine.
Köstlich. Das ist der erbärmlichste Wein, den ich je getrunken habe. Der ist sauer, um Gottes Willen. Trinken Sie aus. Ja, alles. Trinken Sie.
And despite all that, she seems to genuinely care for history, sounding completely in awe at the giant monster she finds deep underground.
Du bist also König Ottos kleines Geheimnis, was? Was? Du siehst so einsam aus. Aber keine Angst, ich bin jetzt da. Und ich habe lecker Fleisch für dich. Ja, amerikanisches Fleisch.
To the point where it doesn't even register to her that it just mauled her. My goodness, even when she's succumbing to her fatal wounds, you'd think she was dying in the recording booth herself.
Habe die Kontrolle verloren.
This is one of those rare times where I don't just think I'm listening to an actor, but an actual person. She sounds so believable in a performance, it's ironically unbelievable. It's incredible they turned a character with maybe 10 lines from Return to Castle Wolfenstein into one of my favorite ones in the entire series, and that's all thanks to Scharnitzky. 1+ mit Sternchen. Her assistant Schreiner is next, played by Hans Eckert. Eckert? Unfortunately, he passed away in 2021. Eckert had a long history as an actor, voice actor, narrator, moderator, and even director. His most notable work was for various radio broadcasts and theater and on TV, but more notable for you guys, he was the voice of Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy. It's unfortunate then that I can't say much about his role here since it's so small. For what it's worth, he's perfectly fine, sounding very uptight and demanding, even having small outbursts now and then.
Genug jetzt von diesem Quatsch, Helga! General Strasse will Ergebnisse sehen. Schicken Sie ihn weg, damit wir unser Gespräch fortsetzen können.
I love his dynamic between him and Helga, sounding like an old married couple, or me when I play games with friends.
Diese Beschimpfungen sind inakzeptabel.
Sehen Sie, Schreiner.
Ja, aber das ändert nichts. Bisher konnten Sie weder mich noch General Strasse beeindrucken, Helga.
Meine Güte, Schreiner, Sie sind ein solcher Korrentenkacker. Hier, sehen Sie.
He even seems somewhat sympathetic at times.
Was ist passiert?
Sie haben den Boden mit Dynamit gesprengt. Das muss das Erdbeben ausgelöst haben.
Gott, diese Stadt.
And I'm not sure if that's also him screaming when he dies, which I doubt a 60-something-year-old was able to do at his age, but it sounds pretty darn good.
Meine Güte!
Overall, a very large actor in a very small role, but he made the most of it. Nice job, Eckhart. May you rest in peace. And that's all the main characters. The random officers and soldiers and whatnot weren't redubbed either, for obvious reasons. This goes for the yelled commands, battle cries, taunts and pain screams, all of which seem to have been recycled from the New Order.
Los, verdammt! Scheiße! Keine Munition mehr! Hab ich dich gefunden! Endlich hab ich dich! Stehen bleiben! Verdammt! Arschloch!
However, some of them were redubbed, and I'm not sure why, since they didn't say anything that needed to get censored, and didn't have any accents either.
Hey, was machen Sie?
Like this soldier, who seems to have been voiced by the same actor I thought was Tim Knauer in the previous video.
War das vielleicht der Amerikaner, über den Helga mit Herrn Schreiner gesprochen hat? Ich habe Geräusche aus der Altstadt gehört. War das vielleicht der Amerikaner, über den Helga mit Herrn Schreiner gesprochen hat?
I think it might actually be Martin Sabel, voice of Booby, who I learned last time actually voiced several characters in this and the next Wolfenstein games. I don't understand why these lines had to be redone, however. Maybe they included something Nazi-related, which had to be taken out, but they couldn't get the same person to reprise their role. Unrelated, I noticed one small oddity. I think at one point, one of the soldiers goes, "Whoops," which I'd never heard in the New Order. Anyway, a lot of the non-combat related lines are also the same in both the original and the German version, more than in the previous title. This was likely because, unlike in that one, they don't have thick Bavarian or Austrian accents here. Here's a few short examples.
Die Papiere bitte. Fahren Sie zum Kontrollpunkt da vorne und zeigen Sie dort Ihre Papiere.
Um Himmels Willen, stramm stehen, Fritz. Herr Jäger kommt gleich. Jawohl.
Ein Foto von Anna! Wir wollen heiraten! Ich hab's auf dem Toilettenboden gefunden. Was soll ich denn sonst damit machen?
Not just the soldiers remained the same over, but almost all the German-speaking characters, whose actors I unfortunately don't know. But some of them really stand out. For instance, the patient/prisoner Markus. You can really hear the confusion, pain and sorrow in his voice. How much he misses his son and how much he's forcing himself to speak through his tears. Actually put me to tears myself.
Oh, mein Junge. Bist du von der Front zurück? Ich hätte nie gedacht, dass ich dich wiedersehe. Oh, mein kleiner süßer Junge. Oh.
Tut mir leid, alter Mann. Du verwechselst mich mit jemandem.
Ich dachte, eine Sekunde lang. Wie die Jahre geflogen sind. Früher saßen wir immer am See, bis die Sonne unterging. Und sahen zu, wie die Schwäne übers Wasser flogen. Ich sehe ihre Spiegelungen im Wasser deutlicher als ich selbst. Ich weiß doch, wie ich dir durchs Haar gefahren bin und du ein bisschen von deinem Brot genommen hast. den Blick fest auf die Angelschnur gerichtet, um sie sofort hochzuziehen, wenn etwas anbeißen sollte. Die Jahre vergangen sind, mein Sohn, nicht wahr?
Another patient is even better, Robert Trommler. I think it might be Schreiner's voice actor Hans Eckert Eckert too, at least they sound very similar at times. Trommler is so reserved, nervous and almost dazed. You can tell how much he struggles to find the words he's looking for, as if he doesn't even know where he is, let alone his mind.
Wollten Sie hier etwas anderes werden? Nein. Nein, natürlich ja. Als Kind. Und was? Ich wollte malen.
And when he begins to recount his recurring dreams and subsequently starts to burst into tears, it genuinely broke my heart.
Ich liege im Gras und die Sonne scheint mir warm auf die Haut. Aber von Osten näherten sich dunkle Wolken. Und plötzlich spüre ich, wie Hände aus dem Boden kommen. Schreckliche, verdrehte Hände mit verrotteter Haut, die wie Papierstreifen vom Fleisch löst und sie schnappen nach mir und zerren mich unter die Erde. Und ich spüre den kalten Boden und die nassen Würmer auf meiner Haut und in der Dunkelheit bewegt sich was. Und es ist etwas nicht Natürliches. Ich bin vor Angst wie gelähmt. Und wenn sich das Ding im Dunkeln auf mich stürzt, dann kann ich nur noch schreien und schreien. Und wenn ich aufwache, ist mein Gesicht nass und Tränen. Und derselbe Traum.
He has so much hurt inside of him and it's just bubbling over without him being able to do anything about it. Astonishing performance gave me actual goosebumps. This is a side character whom you only ever hear in a secret, no less. You could go the entire game without ever coming across him. And yet, he shows some of the most personality I've seen in my Quirks off series yet. If it really was Eckhart, then that was very much a big final hurrah for him. Another patient appears later, Michael Lehmann. He isn't quite as good, but still exceptional, playing a very similar character to Trommler.
Dann nahm er einen Stein und hielt ihn hoch über seinen Kopf. Ich hatte keine Zeit nachzudenken. Ich musste etwas tun, sonst hätte er mich erschlagen. Also stieß ich ihm die Finger in die Augen. Ich spürte, wie ich ein Auge durchstieß und mein Finger in etwas Butterartigem steckte. Warmes Blut rann aus seinem Kopf. Mein Gott, ich kann es immer noch spüren.
A less depressed, but not less unwell patient actually reminded me of some of the actors from German RTCW, especially the weird alchemist in the Paderborn level.
Genau. Ja, meine Liebe, richtig. Nur ein Schluck von dem Gelee, sie ist gesund. Es gibt aber keine Garantie, dass sie überlebt.
Mist, wieder ein Fehler. Versuchen wir es weiter.
There's also some small audio oddities. For instance, in the original, BJ's grandmother thought dementia was transmitted via blood. In the German port, it's his mother for some reason.
Grandma told me it passed through the blood.
Meine Mutter dachte, dass es durchs Blut übertragen wird.
And the secret code phrase was changed from die Narzissen singen im Mondschein to die Lilien singen im Mondschein.
Die Narzissen singen im Mondschein.
Die Lilien singen im Mondschein.
It just occurred to me that it might have been changed because Narzissen sounds like Nazis. Please let me be wrong about that. Don't be this uptight, censors. I'm glad that the Santa Claus joke still works in the German dub too, since they changed it to Nikolaus, the person Santa's based on and whose feast day we still celebrate.
Who is your contact in the village?
Claus.
Who is this Claus?
Santa Claus.
Wer ist deine Kontaktperson im Dorf?
Nico.
Wer ist das, Nico?
Nikolaus.
There's actually more errors when it comes to the subtitles in the audio, with some of them just not matching up or not updating correctly. But these are really minor issues. Overall, the dub isn't bad at all. I think it was much better than in the New Order because not as many characters had to be redubbed due to having thick accents. However, while some of the performances like Rudi, Helga, Annette and Robert Trommler are fantastic, they're not exclusive to the German dub. Still, I have no major complaints when it comes to the voice acting. But how is this port in total? How does it hold up compared to the original or even its predecessor? And is there maybe more to this game than you might have realized? As I just mentioned, the voice acting is perfectly fine. I can't really chalk that up as a big plus though, because most of it already was good in the original. So all of my complaints really have to go towards the game as a whole and not just the dub. The censorship of Nazi imagery on the other hand feels less out of place here than in the New Order. It is a retelling of Return to Castle Wolfenstein after all, so it's fine if it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. I mean, we're literally in Castle Wolfenstein for a lot of the game. It doesn't work so well in combination with the more unoriginal censorship like the Regime though. The Wolfenstein logo for me is synonymous with the wolves, and those are just as absent here as previously. Even Wolfenstein 2009, as generic as it was, still committed to calling them that. It's not brilliant, but I can live with it. However, what I cannot live with is the censorship of references to Judaism. There is no conceivable way in which you could ever reasonably excuse or defend that. Jewish people aren't the enemy here, they don't get portrayed in any disrespectful manner, and neither are crimes against them downplayed in any way. It's blatant, unapologetic censorship of the worst kind. And you might be surprised to hear that for that reason, I'm actually putting this game into the too bad to be good category of German ports, leaning just the slightest bit towards the meh tier. The New Order, as much as it shared the same flaws, didn't land there simply because of its voice acting, which I considered superior to the original at times. But for the Old Blood, most of the audio is the same, and there are no characters that sound truly better in German. There's nothing that makes this port really stand out positively in that sense, which means only the negatives are able to shine. So if you want to play this game, play the original. The German port offers you nothing else. But I'd like to take this moment to discuss the game in general, namely how much it calls back to previous Wolfenstein games. As I already mentioned, it's a retelling of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, the first third at least. Kessler, Helga, Agent 1 and many more characters make a return here, if not slightly altered. However, it goes further than that. Helga's last name now references Dr. Sharps from Wolfenstein 3D. Furthermore, the battle against the Super Soldat at the Castle entrance hall is heavily based on Hans Groß's battle from the same game. Even the cover and title screen are a remake of Wolfenstein 3D's cover art, and they actually reference Mein Leben 2. For real this time, this is not a joke.
Mein Leben!
So I feel this game is a bit of a love letter and final goodbye to a more lighthearted, less serious time of Wolfenstein. As BJ leaves in the plane at the end, he also leaves behind many things that made the series what it was. But I think it doesn't end just there. I think they were also trying to do callbacks to the German Wolfenstein games. The wolves may be gone, but wolves are mentioned a lot, like in the first chapter as well as in the drunkard speech.
Die Wölfe werden uns alle fressen, wenn wir nichts tun.
They did something similar in the New Order, namely Anya's Prayer.
Unsicheres Geleit, inmitten von hungrigen Wölfen.
But here, it feels more deliberate, with this game essentially being a remake of the most popular classic title in the series. I also think that turning Professor Senf into Schreiner might be a callback to German Return to Castle Wolfenstein as well, since he was called Schneider in that one. Sure, it might be a coincidence, as both names are very common, but I don't know. Either way, this is it. The last time we're ever going to see both the more tongue-in-cheek tone of the previous games, as well as how they got censored over here. The wolves have already left us a name, but we're never going to even see their logos again either. But that's something we're going to discuss in the next video about the new Colossus. For now, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this port. Is it as bad as I think it is? Let me know down below and I'll try to read what you have to say. And if you've enjoyed this video, then you can show me that by giving a like, subscribing, or even supporting me directly on Patreon. Anything is appreciated. But for now, thank you very much for watching, have a wonderful day, and goodbye.